Hey, party people. It's your favorite policy and analyst, Matt Rose. We are past the Thanksgiving holiday. We are through most of the elections. We'll talk about the ones still going in just a second. But I want to give you a heads up of what's happening in Washington, what you should pay attention to, what you might care most about, and how it might impact your life. So we have a plethora of things to get done in what we know as a lame duck session before control of Congress shifts, and the Republicans, we think, will take control of the House. Um, Still unsure about what that's actually going to mean. They'll have a very slim majority. It's going to be hard for them to pass anything, but they actually don't have any legislation they want to pass for the most part. Just a lot of stop the woke culture stuff. But since none of that will ever pass in the Senate, we go to divided, paralyzed government for probably the next 2 years. So there will be a lot of terrible things coming out of Washington. I'm sorry, like this is the country we have right now. We didn't win enough races in the right places. And so this is what we're left with. A party that doesn't want to govern, a party that does kind of want to govern, and people left in the middle, left on the outside. But things to see follow in the lame duck sessions that could be relevant to you all. Probably the first and foremost everyone's going to say is the Respect for Marriage Act. This would codify the Obergefell decision saying that states have to recognize marriages performed in other states. This would mean that any LGBT person who got married to a same-sex spouse would be protected, and a T depending on your gender your sexual orientation. So it would codify, and that would codify that not only for same-sex couples, but actually, strangely enough, also for interracial couples, because that was also on the same grounds and of privacy that were prescribed in the Roe decision. So both same-sex couples and interracial couples would now legally have to say that you had full faith and credit when you go to another state, and that's where the conversation is. So important there. It's already passed a test vote in the Senate, so there's at least 62 senators who will vote for it, which means it gets past the threshold for the filibuster. We expect the Senate version to get passed and picked up by the House and then passed by the House. It's actually more restrictive than the House version. It has some more religious liberty carve-outs, unfortunately, but that was the compromise that had to get made. Also happening in this legislation cycle, the Electoral Count Act. I know, sounds boring, kind of is. Basically, it is a way of shoring up some of the weaknesses in the electoral process system that we saw last cycle when Joe Biden had won the election and Donald Trump kept saying, oh, the vice president can do all this. It will clarify that the vice president role is only ceremonial, which we already knew, but apparently we need further clarification on. It will raise the threshold on states objecting to electors to a higher percentage of the states, not rather just one member of the thing, but you need at least a fifth of a delegation of delegates to object. And it will codify and give mechanisms of actions into the court on things that are happening in the states. So states will still run elections like states always have, but things like sending the electors, certification of those elections, there's now a mechanism of action to challenge those in the court if you do not feel like those have been upheld in the state you live in. So that is something we'll probably see pass. Even Mitch McConnell has signaled his support for this. We've seen bipartisan support in the House, although ever so slightly, since a number of those bipartisan Republicans chose not to run for re-election or lost in primaries. But probably we'll get to see that. Another interesting piece that might be relevant to you all, it looks like there is talk about doing a separate deal on the Dreamers. So these are individuals who came to the United States as undocumented children, minors, with their parents, and have only really known the United States as a country. They do all kinds of things. They have President Obama first implemented the Dreamers program to allow as deferred child action. I always forget the acronym, but allows those folks to not be deported just because they were here. There's a sizable chunk of them still in the United States and still being protected, but their lives are in kind of this legal limbo situation. During the Trump administration, they tried to roll back the Dreamer protections. It was upheld and challenged by the court. It did not make it to the Supreme Court, so a ruling was not made. And so it's still floating in the court. And there's all these people from all over who had deferred action on them, have lived and only known America. A lot of the Dreamers are actually in their like 40s now. Fun story. Not so much the kids we talk about anymore. They haven't been able to accept any new people into the program. So it's really a 20s and 30s, 40s crowd that exists. But it might it has carried bipartisan support for a really long time, and there's a chance that it might get done. This is a great piece of progressive legislation that people have wanted for a long time that we could finally see some action on. Woo! Get some wins in there. The next piece, I know, just bear with me. Weed banking. And you might be like, Matt, why the hell do we care about weed banking? Well, actually, because it's still a Schedule 1 narcotic, because the government is federal banks can't hold money for and banks don't want to hold the money because they fear that legal action could require people to seize that money as ill-begotten goods. And so a lot of weed places in states that have legalized have to carry large amounts of cash on themselves and have all kinds of weird banking processes they have to use at huge upsell charges to just do the basic things. Now, initially people were holding up passing the weed banking bill because it was one of the things that Republicans actually really support because they like money and they have a lot of powerful lobbyists working on this. Former Speaker of the House John Boehner is a massive weed lobbyist these days. Interesting, because that was not his stance when he was in the House. But uh, for a while, it had been held in the Senate because Cory Booker was trying to get it attached to a larger larger marijuana bill that also helped legalize marijuana in places and expunged records and provided glide paths and provided recovery programs and tried to make communities whole. That piece of legislation has not been able to come together despite a lot of work on it from Senator Booker and Senator Schumer. The votes just don't appear to be there. So right now they're trying to take the win that they can and at least allow it so that minority businesses who have weed don't get raided for having legal weed shops in their towns. So it will probably make it easier for big developers to come in. So you have to keep mindful of that. If you see legislation around who else can sell weed in your areas, pay close attention to that because it will become more of a state fight. But this will at least allow people access to federal banking and being able to move that money through the federal system, which will make it safer. And there will be less chances of violence and repercussions off that. So a win, but a strange win, but a win. We'll take it. Two more things. First, appropriations. The federal government runs out of money to be authorized to spend on December 16th. One of two or maybe three things will happen on that day. We will either kick the can to further in the year, probably to December 23rd. Why December 23rd? Because it's the day right before people would leave for Christmas. And the best way to make a lawmaker pass something is to give them a holiday deadline, getting between them and their jet entrails. If we don't pass it, we would have to pass a continuing resolution that would fund the government at the current funding levels from fiscal year 2022. Yes, this last fiscal year. 22? Yes. And we would keep funding for maybe a whole year. Probably a whole year because the game in Washington right now is not to let the Republican House have their say on any of these bills. It would be a maelstrom of stuff that could happen with slashes to programs left and right. And they don't seem to, there are many members of that party who do not mind crashing and shutting down the government to try to get what they want, which are probably some very draconian cuts to things like Social Security and Medicaid. I mean, that's really where they're going. They're going to hack and slash a bunch of other things. They probably try to go after Obamacare again. They probably go after education funding because why not? Pretty much anything that's not defense spending, they would want to cut. The Senate Republicans take a much longer view and realize that some of those programs are good and working. And so there is work to try to get an omnibus agreement, which is all 12 spending bills that fund all of the discretionary spending of the federal government, then the additional bigger pot of the mandatory spending of the federal government all get passed before the end of the year. If we do this, we will have these numbers, which are slight raises from years past. We saw some more money in Labor H. We saw some more money in HUD, HUD and transportation. We saw some more money in water and infrastructure. So there's some sprinklings of cash. It's not a big increase. but it is an increase, and that is useful for programs going forward. And there's a modest increase for defense. The Republicans would like a massive increase for defense, and the Democrats will never do that because we realize that the other social programs are all equally important, and the other parts of the budget are equally important, and we need to like fund the government, not just the Department of Defense. But so we pass that by the end of the year, probably by the 23rd, because they haven't figured out top line numbers yet as of this recording on November 28th. But it will be a big fight to see what gets in there, what gets passed, and what happens. If they cannot come to an agreement, then they will pass a continuing resolution that will probably go for the whole year to kick the can on fighting about government spending. Now, that means that no new funding can be authorized and no old funding that's not useful can be moved. And then we have to have the whole fight again at whatever the date they kick the can to. So we're hoping for an omnibus. An omnibus would be lovely. An omnibus would codify a lot of things for the Biden administration, policy changes, some key programs. I will be back in your ear probably in the new year about this or right after it passes. I'll tell you what happened, what we should be excited about, what we should be worried about, what we should be like, well, that's interesting about. But very exciting to see where this goes. Congress loves to give themselves arbitrary deadlines and then blow past those deadlines and then be like, oh my gosh, holidays. We really want to be home for Christmas. Not so much like the Jewish contingent. They're like, Hanukkah, we don't need that. But Christmas is our stopgap. So we'll see what happens. All right. One last piece of important things happening in Washington. The Georgia Senate race. Now, some people will tell you, well, the race doesn't control the Senate. Those people are foolish. Here's why. One, Raphael Warnock is a really good candidate. Herschel Walker, not a good candidate. If you look at what they would vote for and what they wouldn't vote for, you can pretty much figure out what's happening here. But more importantly, the difference between 50 and 51 is very important when it comes to governing. At 51, you do not require the vice president to break ties, which means the vice president can go do other things, like promote the president's agenda around the country, or just even work on some of the things that we put in her portfolio, like, I don't know, the Northern Triangle, which was totally a fair and just thing to give to a person to solve in 4 years. Yeah. Or rural broadband. Now that's actually happening pretty well. There's a lot of work happening to make rural broadband a thing. Kudos to those folks. Good on you. People need internet. Voting rights was also in her portfolio. With Republicans in charge of Congress, I don't think we're getting a lot done on voting rights, but we can be building the ground and seeing what happens. But she doesn't have to be present for all of those. It also gives us some cushion if someone gets sick or is not present. Remember, most of the Senate is what we call septuagenarians, so people in their 70s or older. So things happen. And if things happen, then votes can't happen. And that's happened a number of times this year. It also sets up a better congressional map for some people for the next year. And we have people who are more pro an LGBT economic equality agenda. And it's easier to cut those deals when we have more people. And it might give some mid-layer balance to Senator Manchin. It might continue to moderate some of actions by Republicans. They'll feel less emboldened. So we also don't have to split, the Democrats wouldn't have to split floor time anymore with in deciding on committees. They could have one more vote on a committee, which means committees don't get gridlocked and tie as much. They can also keep passing judges. Without as much holdups, you can also do more appointments. All these things happen with a 51 rather than a 50. So we'll get out of a little bit of the headache from this last year. And some of the things that, if you compare the two people on our important positions, you can kind of see where they fall and who their power centers are looking to hold up, placate, do things with. So all that being said, in the most nonpartisan way possible, voting is very important. You should make sure that everyone you know votes at all opportunities that they have. Make sure that they turn out and understand which candidates are on the ballot. There's only 2 of them. And where they're voting in Georgia. And what a yes vote would do, what a vote for either of those candidates would do for their lives. Trust me, building power and having candidates who respect and share your values is important. And I can't tell you who to vote for because this is a C3, but I can tell you voting, very important, and encouraging and supporting your community to vote, also very important. So take all that as you will. This is your latest federal update. I'll be back in your ear if anything big happens. Otherwise, I'll tell you at the end of the year what we saw, what was good, what was bad, what was ugly, and what we're headed for the next 2 years. All right, y'all. Take care of yourselves. Take care of one another. Have a good day.